In a certain small town near here, all the people were very proud of their old parish church. They loved its stained glass windows, its carved pews, its fine tower, its shiny brasses, and its solid silver altar candlesticks. But there was one part of it which they didn't seem to care about at all, and that was the vestry roof. The church mice, who lived in the vestry, cared about it a great deal. Whenever it rained, the water ran in between the broken tiles and poured down on their heads. And Samson, the church cat, cared about it too, because he also lived in the vestry. Unlike most cats, Samson didn't chase mice. Some of his best friends were mice. But in every other way, he was just an ordinary cat. And being an ordinary cat, he absolutely hated getting his feet wet. A fund had been started for the repair of the vestry roof, and Samson and the mice were in charge of the collection. Every evening, they counted the money that had been put into the box during the day and added it to the amount already collected. On rainy afternoons, when there were too many puddles on the vestry floor for them to play bingo or postman's knock or marbles or jacks, the mice often went across to the parsonage to watch the telly. And as they watched, they couldn't help noticing that cats and mice were very popular actors. And one evening, in the vestry, they talked this over. Humphrey said that actors were paid £1 billion a week, plus their bus fares. With that much money, he pointed out, they could not only mend the vestry roof, but buy a patent-expanding, everlasting cake frill for the parson, and perhaps even have enough left over to treat themselves to a packet of cheese biscuits. So, it was decided that Samson, being the only cat present, and Arthur and Humphrey being the cleverest of the mice, they should become actors and earn the money that was needed. Before they went to bed that night, Humphrey and Arthur spent an hour or so brushing up their dancing, their acting, and their singing. But Samson said he wasn't going to bother with all that stuff. He was just going to rely on natural charm and good looks. He went to bed early to make sure he wouldn't have bags under his eyes in the morning. And next morning, Arthur, Humphrey and Samson called on an actor's agent to see what he had to offer. The agent didn't seem exactly delighted to see them. He didn't even ask them to perform to show how talented they were. They showed him just the same. Humphrey did the Sugar Plum Fairies dance, and Arthur recited The Owl and the Pussycat, and Samson did the Cheshire Cat smile from Alice in Wonderland. He did it twice because it didn't last very long. The agent wasn't impressed. He said that if they'd been seals that balanced balls on their noses, or poodles that rode bicycles, or even fleas that pulled little carts, he could have helped them. But at the moment, things were a bit slack for smirking cats and ballet dancing mice. They were just about to leave, feeling a little downhearted, when an odd-looking gentleman came bursting in through the door. "Great man," he cried, seeing Samson. "Just what I want. A scruffy, uncuddly ruffian of an alley cat to star in my next cat food advertising film." It seemed he was a film director. He told them he was shooting his new film on a South Sea island, so that cats would think that eating tinned cat food was romantic and adventurous. Samson didn't want to be in the film. For one thing, he was sulking about being called uncuddly, and for another, he wanted to act in a film where he married the heroine and lived happily ever after. But the two mice told the director that they were Samson's managers and that he jolly well would be in the film. So that was settled, and the agent reserved 3 first-class seats on the boat train to Southampton. They were to sail for the South Sea Islands on the following day. Next morning, very early, the 3 friends set off, telling the mice that they would be home the day after next, but not to keep tea waiting because the South Sea Islands were quite a long way off and they might get held up in the rush hour traffic. They caught the Southampton boat train, found their reserved seats, and had a comfortable and pleasant journey. Well, fairly pleasant. They seemed to cause a great stir at the quayside. But Samson didn't let it go to his head. When the fuss was over, they went on board, and soon after that, the ship sailed for the South Sea Islands. The South Sea Islands were much further off than they thought. They were on the ship for days and days. Sometimes it was very nice, and sometimes it wasn't. But at last, after changing ships several times, they arrived at a small but romantic South Sea island, where everyone went ashore and Samson was made up and dressed in his costume. The director showed Samson exactly what he had to do. Just wink roguishly at the camera, then stroll nonchalantly up to the tin of Fat Cat and take a few masterful mouthfuls, he said. Make all those molly-coddled fireside cats want to eat Fat Cat so as to be smooth, suave, cool, dangerous, dashing, elegant, arrogant, adventurous and sophisticated, just like you. Righto, said Samson. But somehow things didn't work out like that. After a day of Samson's acting, the director had a nervous breakdown and came out in a nasty rash. He had to be taken straight home. Samson and the two mice were left behind on the island because the director said he'd jump overboard before he'd sail on the same ship with them. They spent a rather scary night under a bush. The two mice didn't blame Samson because, as Humphrey said, a fellow couldn't help being born a nincompoop, and they'd be all right because South Sea Islands have plenty of nuts and fish and fruit and things, so they wouldn't starve. He was right about the things, because they saw plenty of those during the night. And the next morning, they found there were nuts, too, and fish. However, they were able to pick some fruit. Humphrey said this would stop them getting dandruff and boils, and one had to think about one's appearance, even on a desert island. Despite this, Samson didn't really fancy bananas, and some of the berries tended to do rather funny things to mouse insides. By midday, they had got very hot and homesick. They thought how nice it would be to be back in the vestry with a lovely cool rain pouring through the roof onto their heads, and they became quite weepy and sorry for themselves. But Arthur blew his nose and said that kind of thing would get them nowhere. They must pull up their socks, stop moping about, and do something practical, like building a boat and rowing home. They weren't quite sure which was the best way to England. Arthur said that they should row to the right, and Samson said they should row to the left, and Humphrey said they would definitely have to row straight ahead. So they decided to zigzag in order to please everybody. As things turned out, it didn't really matter. But they didn't despair. Instead, they explored the island in the hope of finding something useful. And they did. A pile of cheese and sardine sandwiches and a short-sighted old gentleman. They left the bread because it's not nice to be greedy, is it? And anyway, they only liked bread if it had peanut butter on it. After the cheese and sardines, they went for a stroll on the beach, where they saw something which really cheered them up. A new ship had arrived. Humphrey read the sign on its side and said that all they had to do now was to get discovered, and they would straight away be taken home. They might not be rare on the outside, he said, but anybody could see that they had rare minds. But when the head scientist came ashore, he just glanced at the three friends, who were smiling their best smiles and trying to look rare, as he muttered scornfully, "One CD Felis catus and a pair of musculi, how very, very common." And with that, he walked off. They tried stowing away in the scientist's launch, but were discovered before they were halfway to the ship and tossed overboard. If a log hadn't been drifting towards the beach, something very nasty might have happened to them. Even that didn't discourage them. Next morning, they visited the short-sighted old gentleman again. It was a bit of a blow to find that he'd changed to cucumber and watercress sandwiches, but just then Samson had an idea so brilliant that he quite forgot he was hungry. He whispered it to the mice, and they started on it right away. It was really very hard and artistic work, but it was quite fun too. And when they'd finished, they all three looked very, very rare indeed. Then they went back to the beach to wait for the scientists. Humphrey had made up a little speech. He was going to say that, as rare animals weren't very common, they had decided to sacrifice their freedom in the noble cause of science and knowledge. But he didn't get a chance. Before he could open his mouth, the zoologists had whisked them off to the ship. They were clearly not going to find anything rarer than Samson and his two friends, so the ship sailed for England right away. During the voyage, the scientists studied them very carefully, but were so interested in their insides that they never noticed that their outsides were painted. they received a big welcome when their ship docked. And after giving their views on marriage, the common market, pollution, and signing love from an extremely rare animal in hundreds of autograph books, they were rushed off to the zoo. They hated the zoo right from the very start. There was absolutely nothing to do and nowhere to go. And besides, everybody's manners were so appalling. As Humphrey said, how would people like it if a bunch of strange mice came and stared in through their windows all day? After 3 days, they were all fed up with it. And Samson thought to himself,
if a fellow can get himself and his friends off a South Sea island by sheer brain power, then a fellow can get himself and his friends out of a silly old zoo.
So he pondered for a while and had another brilliant idea. He carefully washed off the red spots, and then he called the keeper.
I've got measles, he groaned. I know I have, because when a rare exotic red-spotted creature like me catches measles, instead of coming out in red spots, the ones he already has go in.
So he was rushed off to the zoo hospital, where he was put in a room all by himself because of being contagious as well as rare. There, he quickly washed off the rest of the paint so that he looked his old self again. Then he walked boldly out of his room and down the corridor to the back of the mice's cage, and no one spared him a second glance, because now he was just a rather common-looking ginger tomcat. He snatched the mice from their cage and bolted. Luckily, the surprise had given him a head start. Once they were safe, he dunked the mice in a puddle to wash the paint off them, and then they thumbed a lift. Within a few hours, they were home. And what a welcome they received when they entered the vestry. Arthur said with a lump in his throat that it made all the unspeakable, terrible hardships that they had endured on their travels worthwhile. They weren't even disappointed that the travelers had come back without the money to repair the vestry roof.
After all, said Samson, it takes more than a leaky roof to dampen the feelings of true friendship.
Then he blushed, because he didn't usually say such sloppy things like that. Goodbye.